Good. So we started recording, but as I said, you can make as much noise as you like because we've just turned your microphone off. Of course, I don't get any feedback. You might be groaning, falling asleep, snoring. I won't know, so you can get away with that. We're going to look this morning at the start of Jesus' ministry. So if you remember last time, I think we covered Jesus' birth, didn't we, and kind of growing up. Oh no, actually no, that was 2 times ago. Last time we kind of looked in overview, so we looked at the kind of the different steps and stages of Jesus' ministry. So we're going to look at this kind of first phase, when I do these, they're constantly kind of evolving. So I will regularly notice things that I'm going through, saying, actually, no, we should change that, and I'm doing that straight away here. So if you got your notes, it says summer AD 29 to summer AD 30. When I put that summer AD 29, I think I was probably being unduly, in my mind now, influenced by the way in which we tend to compress the events of Jesus's life. And it's kind of, the logic is, well, if the gospel doesn't spell it out, then it didn't happen. But actually, we know that Jesus' ministry takes place over 3.5 years. We kind of can follow it. We saw that last time as we looked at the different stages. And the more I kind of engage with this and think about it, the more convinced I am of the kind of a significant chunk of time that Jesus has spent under John the Baptist's ministry. And there's always that question. So why don't the Gospels tell us more? And as we'll notice, it kind of is inferred, but it's not really explicit. And because it's not really explicit, we kind of almost assume that Jesus' contact with John the Baptist is kind of almost instantaneous. You know how it goes. John the Baptist comes and he's preaching and people are coming to him. One day Jesus turns up. He's not really sure who he is, even though he's his cousin. But he then, as he walks up, he kind of says, oh, you don't need baptizing. And Jesus says, yes. He gets baptized. And then Jesus gets out of the water, goes straight off into the wilderness, spends 40 days in the wilderness, comes back, heads straight off to Galilee. And it all kind of happens in a moment. It kind of happens in a few days, apart from the fact that 40 days in the wilderness. The longer I take with it, the more convinced I am that actually Jesus is with John for a very significant part of the overlap of the ministries. And that makes more sense of the prophetic context, that John as a character is prophesied quite significantly in the Old Testament. He's in Malachi, he's there in Isaiah, and there's this great expectation of the forerunner and the preparer. And then Jesus himself talks about, if you're going to have your own ministry, you need to be faithful with somebody else's. That's in Luke 16. And while we can make special exceptions for Jesus, it feels more honouring to kind of imagine that Jesus has done the same. He has worked under John the Baptist's ministry. And so I would probably, instead of saying summer AD 29, I would kind of take it right the way back. We can't be 100%, but actually I suspect that Jesus is in the environment of John the Baptist's ministry, watching and observing, discovering how things work, becoming a kind of a semi-teacher in the same way that Jesus develops disciples who pick up the work. He becomes to a role of significance. So John the Baptist's own followers later on will say, he who was with you. They don't say he who was with us. It's as though Jesus, when he was with John, had higher status than those particular disciples of John the Baptist do later on. There seems to be a real affection between Jesus and John, which kind of tends to be the sort of thing that has emerged from a longer term ministry. So this first phase we're going to look at is dominated in one sense by John the Baptist. It's basically, it finishes with John the Baptist's arrest. And as I said, to understand that actually there's probably a much more of a toing and froing and discovery of things together with Jesus and John. And that doesn't in any sense take away from Jesus, because the New Testament is very clear that Jesus accomplishes everything he does. He accomplishes the cross in his humanity. So that kind of, you hear that little bit of logic, that Jesus came according to the flesh. In other words, according to being a normal human being. And so in actual fact, as a normal human being, even though he is the Son of God, even though he is the eternal Word, he has come as a normal human being who has to go through normal processes, which include kind of that sense of mentoring, development, growth, and so on. And John kind of represents a chunk of that. So I'm spending a long time on that first slide, which is really just the the title. So just to kind of see where we're going to go today. Obviously, we start with the fact that John is preaching, and then we move into the baptism and temptation of Jesus. And then we know from John's gospel, you notice we got this little color code. Sorry, I'm pointing it at my screen. You can't. You're looking on your screen. It's kind of behind you up here, I guess. We've got the little color code things. You'll notice there are nothing here that's in green. That color code is from last time when we were looking at things that are in 2 gospels. So the things that are just in John's gospel then, Jesus is with John the Baptist after coming out of the wilderness and the temptation, and that's where he's meeting his disciples for the first time. And that's one of the things, again, that gives us the impression of the length of time, because the book of Acts is quite clear that all of the disciples of Jesus have first met him under the ministry of John the Baptist. So although we only read about a handful of them in John's gospel, the clear, if you like, articulation that you get in Luke's gospel is, and then in the book of Acts, Luke's writing, is that they were around right from the days of John the Baptist. So before John is arrested, all of Jesus' disciples have met him, even though we haven't read about those first encounters. And then we read about the wedding that goes on in Cana, and then there's the first Passover that happens down in Jerusalem. Then there's a mission to Samaria. And after the mission to Samaria, Jesus comes into Galilee with some of his disciples. But this is before John has formally been arrested at this point. And so there's a kind of an early phase where Jesus is, if you like, practicing being on his own, if I can put it that way. And it's not that he's itinerating on a tour with disciples following him. But he is kind of dropping in, and it's often unrecorded, but he's going into synagogues and teaching, which is not dissimilar to the thing other rabbis are doing. So he's kind of just developing as a rabbi. He visits a local synagogue, he's doing some stuff there, and we hear about that in all 3 of the synoptic gospels, that there's a kind of a phase which we don't have a lot of information about. And significant within that phase is the time when he comes to Nazareth, which is his hometown. And it's around that period that John the Baptist seems to get arrested, and he moves then from Nazareth to Capernaum. And it's where he's at Capernaum, he then starts to kind of move around and recollect his disciples, and they all go off on their first Galilean tour. So some of that kind of those things that we hear about where Jesus goes down and sees Simon Peter and Andrew, says, "Come and follow me," is not the first time they've met Jesus. They've already got this relationship with him. It's actually the start of Jesus's itinerant ministry. So that's where we're going to finish today, as we kind of get to it. So you've got a little map, just to kind of highlight. So Jesus has grown up in the town of Nazareth, which is just below a huge building site that's been developed through most of Jesus' kind of young adult life. There's been a huge amount of building work just 3.5 miles to the north of Nazareth, and that's probably where he's spent his kind of professional working life. He's probably started it with his father, although Joseph has died by this stage, or seems to have died by this stage. And in that context, we read about John comes out of the wilderness. And now the wilderness, if you look down at the bottom of your map, really kind of runs around the west side, the top and the west side of the Sea of the Dead Sea. If you ever see photos from around there, you see it's all kind of rocky kind of ground. It's not good for growing on and so on. The heavy salts that, of course, make the Dead Sea so salty are all part of the terrain, so it's difficult for stuff to grow on. So the wilderness is around that area. And we read in the Gospels how John comes up out of the wilderness, but it also says that people went to him in the wilderness. And so obviously he's found a location that, depending on your perspective, is either in the wilderness or out of the wilderness. So it's not necessarily the deep wilderness. And that actually Bethbara, which we kind of highlighted, I think, last time, which is kind of got that circle on it, that's a really good place that fits that description, coming out of the wilderness. It's just at the top of the Dead Sea. So he goes down there, and Jesus comes to meet him, which is southwest of Jericho. John is baptizing, he's ministering there. So we assume that John starts his ministry, word starts to go out. Jesus leaves his hometown and comes down to this region where John is baptizing. And if we kind of try and interlace the accounts, Jesus arrives. We know that John, kind of when he meets Jesus, he must know who Jesus is, because Jesus is a cousin. They may not have had a huge amount of contact growing up, because Elizabeth is an elderly relative, and Jesus' mother Mary, who's the relative of her, is a young girl having her first child. Elizabeth will have had John, and we don't know how many years they had as parents, but they will have died much, way before. And so while there may have been some early kind of contact, there's a lot of gap and a lot of years. But into that context, Jesus comes down, and there's probably some level of re-establishing of relationship, that you are my cousin, we share family. And actually in kind of old pastoral communities, that kind of thing is much more common, that you have family members, but because of travel and transport and so on, there can be distance and gap, but actually they're still family members, and you still recognize them, and you, in the sense of, if they come and introduce themselves, you have a connection with them. So presumably into that kind of context, as Jesus has arrived, he's flagged, we have common ancestry, we have some kind of commonality, and maybe even in John's mind it reminds him of some of the stories that have been given to him by his parents, of the calling he has. But so we don't know the exact moment in this where, if you like, the realization is that Jesus is the person that John was to prepare the way for. But we kind of, the way we hear it written in the Gospels is he didn't really fully recognize him at first, but at some point, maybe actually at his baptism, but maybe even a little moment or so before then, it kind of finally clicks of, this is the person I'm preparing the way for. He's not just my cousin who's come down, and actually his mother visited my mother when they were both pregnant, and so on and so forth. And he really is. So we get that kind of the way the narrative works. So Jesus comes to him, and he says to him, look, you don't need to go through baptism. So, and this thing of baptism that John is doing, it's based, we find it's based on a proper Hebrew ceremony, which is washing when someone is a proselyte, i.e. they weren't Jewish and they're going to become Jewish, and as part of the routine, and they're going to get circumcised. Well, the Jews themselves don't need to be circumcised again, but by saying we need to rewash, the Essenes brought in a kind of a sense of which we can't assume that we're somehow better because we received circumcision. We actually need to prepare our hearts, and symbolically and prophetically we go through an immersive washing ritual. And it was that was part of the Essene community, and that influence seems to have been picked up by John, and he kind of comes and says to everybody, we all need to go through this. It's not just for that particular group. If you want to come into an Essene community, you have to go through this ritual, but I'm going to say, spread this out. Something about our hearts, it's almost like we all have to reconvert. We all have to acknowledge that we're coming back. And so he's taken that, and yet when Jesus presents himself, he says, look, you're not one of those that I'm talking about. And he refers to him as the Son of God, and tries to put Jesus off. But Jesus' kind of response to him, as you kind of get it, is it's as if Jesus has seen something in the ritual that is more than just the technical, do I need to be washed? So there's something in it. And I think the thing that's perhaps in it, when I say Jesus has seen something in the ritual, is probably to do with the washing of sacrifice. In Malachi, it talks about the Son of Righteousness and so on that's risen. But I'm going to quickly look it up. It talks there about a righteous priest who's there to prepare the sacrifice. And Malachi is, of course, one of those passages that's prophesying John the Baptist. So I've got Isaiah open at a minute. Let me quickly zip across to Malachi so I can read the words properly. So Malachi, which of course is the very last book. So it says, behold, I'm going to send my messenger. He'll clear away before me. This is part of, if you like, the prophetic context of John the Baptist. And it talks about him being like a smelter or purifier of silver. He'll purify the sons of Levi. So John himself is a son of Levi. He is a priest. If you remember, his father is a priest. So purifying the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so they may present to the Lord offerings of righteousness. And so here we have John, who has been selected as a son of Levi, and himself has been purified so that he can present a good offering. Does that making sense? So we often hear the prophecies about him coming and preaching and preparing the people, but it's not just that. He's also been purified for the purposes of presenting an offering. And there's a kind of something in baptism which is about like the preparation when an offering is brought, that it is washed before it's sacrificed. And so Jesus kind of recognizes that as he's going to become, or he has an inkling by the Holy Spirit that it's important for him to actually go through this, for John even to fulfill his kind of a role in that sort of a way. So he offers himself, and as he goes down into the water, so John is baptizing. I think what we should imagine is not that everybody is standing around respectfully listening for Jesus about to give his conversion testimony like we sometimes do. If you ever go down to Revive, I love going to the baptisms on Sunday, and we all sit very quietly on the bank as they tell their story and so on. But I suspect it was a bit noisier and a bit less organised than that. And there is the kind of context where probably people are coming to John as he's in the water to go through this washing, and people are kind of not really focusing on it. It's just happening in the midst of stuff. John having preached and said, we're going to be doing this, who wants to go through it? Folks are probably coming to him one at a time. So Jesus has approached him. They've had the dialogue. You really don't need to. Jesus says, yes, I do. So Jesus goes down into the water, and as he comes up, he is aware of something spiritually opening up for him. And so I think it's Mark's gospel that talks about the heavens being open to him, and both Jesus and John there's a dove that kind of flies by, probably a real one where I'd see it, that they understand as being a symbol of the Holy Spirit that perhaps comes down, but it's not a kind of an awed silence. Oh, what's going on? I think it's just happening in the moment. The dove kind of flies in and they understand its meaning. Jesus has that experience of heaven becoming kind of open to him in a new way. And I put there as this kind of fulfillment of Isaiah 64, which starts with rend the heavens and come down. Isaiah 64 isn't fully fulfilled until we see the crucifixion. And then the next line of rend the heavens and come down and the earth shaking, that actually happens at the crucifixion. The earth actually shakes. But as you kind of read through Isaiah 64, there are various bits, some of which kind of relate more generically to the ministry of Jesus. If we take a God perspective on these things, the 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry are a real moment in eternity. And so actually we often find that with prophecy, is that you kind of have packed together a number of things that actually roll themselves out over a lifetime or over a longer period of time. Other times we have things kind of spread across, but actually when they happen, they seem to happen in a moment. So prophecy doesn't always kind of follow exactly the same sort of timeline that that the events do. And so something about the baptism of Jesus, which is tied to the death of Jesus, which is a theme that you find right the way through the New Testament, that baptism is a prophecy of his death. It goes into the water is like going into the grave. Coming out of the water is like his resurrection. And so at this moment we find some of Isaiah 64 being fulfilled. At the crucifixion we find the rest of it being fulfilled. It's kind of like this whole thing of this 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry is shaped by the sacrifice he's going to bring. And here we find, if you like, the Levi who's been cleaned up, the good Levi, because he's not a corrupt one like the ones down at the temple, who's preparing and washing the sacrifice as well as preaching and preparing people's hearts. And then in that context, it's just Jesus and John who hear the commissioning words. So as they come up out of the water and heaven speaks, they're the ones who are aware of those words. But we've got them recorded, which is good. So we can be aware of them and understand their implications. Oh, I've gone the wrong way, haven't I? Let's go back. Let me go in the right direction. There we are. So the words as Jesus comes up out of the water, this is my beloved son, or this is my son beloved, is actually the way the Greek reads. This is my son beloved, in whom I'm well pleased. And there's an incredible kind of prophetic meaning in this statement. So this is my son is from Psalm 2, and it's a messianic title. it says, I will tell of the decree of the Lord. This is the Messiah speaking. So the Messiah is speaking. He says, I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. So Jesus and John have heard these words. Nobody else has. But we've got them because actually Jesus has told of the decree as he's come up out of the water that you are my son is part of the decree. In whom I'm well pleased, the last part, actually comes from Isaiah, and it's the way that the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, it's the way that it translates Isaiah 42, where we normally in our English we read in whom my soul delights, but the Greek kind of says I'm in whom I'm well pleased. So we have the Messiah from Psalm 2, we have the suffering servant from Isaiah who's been prophesied at that moment, the person who's going to suffer on behalf of the people. So the Messiah and the sufferer. And then in the middle we have the word beloved. Pardon me. And that could be related to David. The name David just means beloved. But I think more specifically I tend to relate the word beloved to the bridegroom because... the bridegroom is a character that appears prophetically in Jeremiah, and actually in Jeremiah 3 times we read about the joy of the bridegroom being cut off, and then right at the end of Jeremiah we have the joy of the bridegroom is returning, and we get this kind of again this character who's having a wedding, but his wedding has been spoilt, he's been cut off, but he then returns and there's all the joy is restored. And that image is picked up by Jesus, and it wasn't one that had particularly hit the imagination of the Jewish people up to now, but Jesus talks about himself as the bridegroom right from the very beginning of his ministry. So much so that by the time we get to the book of Revelation, the church is understanding he's being cut off and he's going to be returning, and there'll be a marriage supper of the Lamb, you know how it goes. And all of that is packed into this little declaration, this little phrase that is spoken over Jesus as he comes up out of the water, this kind of commissioning way. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm taking a lot longer in each slide than probably I'm supposed to, but hopefully you can kind of you can live with that as we're kind of running through. He's had this quite incredible commission, which requires a lot of thinking and what does this really mean. I've been aware through my prophecies and everything else, and I've had this sense since I was 12 years old. This is talking as if I'm Jesus. Since I was 12 years old, I've had this sense of God's fatherhood over me. Oh, I forgot to mention actually that Isaiah 64 is one of the handful of times in the Old Testament which makes an explicit reference to God as Father. But that's just another little thing. So Jesus has had that sense of God as his Father since he was 12. You know, shouldn't I be about my Father's business? Here's this quite incredible decree. There's a clear, obvious sense in which we're stepping now into something new. He may have been with John already for a while up to this point. He's now decided to go through this rite. We don't know how, he's been washed. Perhaps he's come to a place of realization why it's important, even though he doesn't necessarily need it. But he's understood that. He's gone into the water. He's come up. He's heard a quite incredible commission with three prophetic threads to it. And the way Mark says it is he went immediately into the wilderness. But Mark's whole gospel is very it's very kind of dramatic. So actually that word immediately, if we read Luke, he says he returned from the Jordan and then was led under the influence of the Spirit. So really what it means is the thing that's about to happen next, the most important kind of thing to report to you from his baptism, is that the next phase is his kind of processing that in the wilderness. But it's not that he comes straight out of the water and shoots off. It probably he returns from it wherever he's lodging at this particular time. But something hits him that actually he needs to really process this. So he goes out to the wilderness under the guidance and the influence of the Holy Spirit. And of course, as we know, as we get there, it's where he encounters Satan, is the adversary. But as well as Satan, we often forget he also meets wild animals and the angels. And we read about those particularly in Mark's Gospel, the animals coming to him, which kind of represents Jesus as a kind of a new Adam, because the animals comes to Adam, Satan comes to Adam, and the angels also are there with Adam's story. Although unfortunately, the angels are stopping Adam kind of returning to the tree in Genesis. But you kind of got all of those elements are kind of reworking. And as I put here, the actual commission that Jesus has been given as he comes up out of the water. We actually find it being deliberately challenged, kind of almost point by point. We'll look at that in a second. There are kind of 3 layers of anointing that are challenged as well in that challenge. So there's a challenge to the commission, and the challenge itself is to 3 different kind of types of anointing. So I put here, note the context of Psalm 91. Psalm 91 starts with God covering the psalmist with his pinions, which is his wings. So being covered by the wings in Psalm 91. And I've got here, so Psalm 91 and the baptism temptation. So he'll cover you with his pinions. Under his wings you can seek refuge. He will put his angels in charge of you. So you see these characters that come out in the wilderness. So there are angels who have been put in charge of you. They will guard you in all your ways. And then very specifically, and they will bear you up on their hands so that you don't dash your foot against a stone. And there's a very kind of clear sense in which the way that as the devil comes in, Jesus has gone through an experience where he's been covered by the pinions. Therefore, implicit in that is this protective prophecy in Psalm 91. He will put his angels in charge of you. And so the devil comes straight in. Well, if he's going to do that, tell you what, you should put it to the test. You should try it out. And interestingly, the devil actually takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple, if you remember. And although, of course, the New Testament is written in Aramaic, the New Testament is written in Greek, in Hebrew or Aramaic, actually Jesus probably spoke both. One is kind of the language of the market in Jesus' day, and the other is the language of the synagogue. So people could speak they could speak posh, and they could speak they could speak casual. But in both Aramaic and Hebrew, the word for pinnacle is actually the same word as the word for a pinion or for a wing, and it's to do with the kind of that stretching edge that kind of stretches up into the sky, you see. And so there's a kind of little wordplay going on here. Just if anyone's interested in these things, because I like to be smug, is I've never read that anywhere. I discovered it myself. I was just playing around once with my kind of my Bible software, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, and it made me think straight away of this. So actually the word for pinnacle in Hebrew is the same word as the word that we translate here as pinion. So the devil has actually taken Jesus to something that kind of reminds him of where the promise starts, Psalm 91, because he's been covered by the pinions, and in that kind of place he's kind of the challenge is, well, if the angels won't let you hurt your foot, you could just jump off. And actually in Psalm 91, it talks about you'll tread on the lion and the cobra, and you'll trample the young lion and the serpent underfoot. And obviously, the serpent from of old, and the prophecy is that that one day Eve would have a son, the seed of a woman. So the seed of a woman would come and would crush the serpent's head, and that we get that little idea that is there in Psalm 91. And it also refers to the young lion. The New Testament refers to the devil as being a lion, a roaring lion, as well as being the serpent as of old. And so you kind of have this sense in which even in the psalm there's this tension of something where the devil needs to be trodden on, needs to be dealt with. And I've just kind of touched, of course, about the young lion and the serpent. Also, you kind of get that sense of the animal world coming into Psalm 91. Sorry, I realise I'm pointing at my screen as I look at it here. You're just seeing me kind of pointing at you. So you kind of get. But anyway, and actually we find the word Jesus, actually, my salvation, Jesus of me, is the very last word of Psalm 91. Because you can see there's a kind of a strong prophetic sense of this psalm that dominates this period where Jesus is out in the wilderness. He's praying and he's fasting. He's going without food. He's going without water, and he's processing this incredible prophetic word as he's come up out of the water. What does it mean to be my son? My son is a victorious king, but I'm also in whom I'm well pleased. That is a servant who suffers on behalf of the people and who empathizes with them in their suffering. And in the middle is this idea of the beloved, who the beloved is regularly used of a character who is the bridegroom. We find it in Song of Solomon. So the bridegroom idea comes together. And Jesus must have been processing all of these over these days out in the wilderness. So this is one of the tricky things where if I was live right now, I would be saying, what do people think of that? So think of that. What do you think of those things? How does it make sense? the way it makes most sense for me is actually just to notice it and to kind of let it shape, and those kind of questions come back to you as you're reading scripture for yourself. So what does it mean for Jesus to be the bridegroom? What does it mean for him to be the victorious son? What does it mean for him to be the suffering servant? What does it mean for the whole of his ministry to be shaped, if you like, by the prophetic content of this event, which was foreshadowed in Psalm 91? I've got here, we're kind of just unpacking it further and further. So far, I think we're doing about 24 hours at the start of Jesus' ministry, and we're taking the first half of this morning just to look at this this one thing. So Jesus is the second Adam, and the threefold anointing that is also going on, you see, with the temptation process. So if you think about the parallel, so Adam starts, he's in a paradise that's been gifted to him, where he's supposed to care for the animals, and he can eat from every tree except one. So he's got masses that he can eat. The animals are kind of coming to him, but he fails when he's tested by Satan. Satan comes, the serpent of old, and of course, as a result, the land becomes unfruitful. We kind of have, if you like, a symbolic process going on here that is almost in reverse. So Jesus is now going into an unfruitful and barren wilderness, and in that context, he's choosing not to eat or drink. He doesn't drink, eats anything. Actually, we read about animals coming to him, as well as Satan, and as well as angels. But he comes through the testing, resisting it, and actually opens a way for a kind of renewed blessing, if you think of it in those kind of ways. So we kind of almost have a recapitulation, I think, of the idea. So events that happen in the dawn of humanity, where there was failure and actually led us in one direction. We have, if you like, in Jesus kind of starting with none of the advantages that Adam does, but he somehow remodels the same process, but now in reverse, and starts to turn it around. I mean, you think as well in the actual temptations, the three temptations. We could look at these in different ways, but there's a kind of a challenge to the three anointings from the Old Testament. There are three different types of people who get anointed in the Old Testament. There's prophets. So when the Spirit would come on, and the prophets would be anointed, and they would prophesy. Obviously, there are priests who have to be anointed before they're allowed to minister. And kings who are anointed when they become king. So Jesus has gone through an anointing experience. He's gone through a baptism, and the Spirit has come down on him as a second kind of layer of that anointing. So he's been anointed as prophet, a priest, and a king. The king is my son. The priest is actually in my servant, because the servant is kind of seen in a priestly mediating role. So perhaps, although it's not as obvious, but the beloved is probably the prophet, because exactly half of the Psalms are attributed to David. 73 of them have the name David in the title, and 2 of them are referred to in the New Testament as being Psalms of David, even though they don't have David in the title. So half the Psalms were by David, which means the beloved. So you have kind of the king, we have the priest, and we have the beloved, and we have that prophetic flow from David of the Psalms. So all 3 of those anointings are there in that kind of that statement, and they're all challenged, because, of course, as the ultimate prophet, Moses provides the wilderness, and one of the temptations is turn the stones into bread. You could do the prophet thing, you can do it your way. And there's a priestly thing that's challenged, because the temple, throw yourself off the temple, everybody will know who's come up to the temple that you are so important. And there's a kingly kind of dimension, because the devil says to Jesus, bow down to me and I'll give you the nations. If you go back to Psalm 2, after it says, I will tell you the decree, he's said to me, you are my son. He then says, ask of me, this is of God, and I will give you the nations. So the devil kind of saying, ask of me, is a direct challenge. So you get that sense in which actually the temptation is a challenge to all 3 of these anointings, which are kind of implicit in the title that is spoken over Jesus as he comes up out of the water. So that was a long kind of, if you like, more theological teaching on a single event. We're kind of covering the flow and the process. So we'll get going on that now. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Don't worry, Phil. So we will take a proper break and so on. Anyway, so according to Acts, as I said, all 12 of the disciples are now going to meet Jesus in the context of John the Baptist's ministry. Whether some have already met him or not, we don't know. But we don't read about it, except that we read about it for a handful of them. I think it's five of them? Five of them that we read about in John's Gospel. So in John's Gospel, there's John, who's the author of the Gospel, put the elder and the apostle, John the elder stroke apostle. We'll think about that in a second. There's Andrew, who is the brother of Simon, and they're the first people to that we read about in John's Gospel meeting Jesus. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in real history they were, but in terms of we don't have any other description other than the one from John's Gospel. And John deliberately presents himself. He's an unnamed disciple, and because John doesn't name himself right the way through, he says, and I'm the one who's been writing this at the very end. There's an unnamed disciple, and he goes with Andrew. And Andrew and John also finish the gospel, and what John is doing there is a standard thing in ancient world histories, which is what we're telling you. I've been an eyewitness to, and here's my other key eyewitness is Andrew, and at the very end and then the third person is Simon Peter. So we kind of go John, Andrew, Simon. At the end of John's gospel, in the final chapter, it goes in the reverse order. So Simon speaks, and then it talks about the we, which we know from the early church, who endorsed the gospel, includes Andrew, and then finally it's an I am the beloved disciple. And that kind of is a way, they call it an inclusio, of saying we were eyewitnesses to all of these events, so you can trust us. That's really why they're doing it. So that doesn't mean to say that, for instance, I won't say Bartholomew, that's not a bad choice, but that doesn't mean to say Matthew hasn't met Jesus already, but we don't read about it because actually John's gospel is showing you we were the kind of key witnesses to this narrative that we're giving you. So there's John, there's Andrew, there's Simon, there's Philip, and I put here Guilfried Nathaniel, who the other gospel writers call Bartholomew, which is not a contradiction. Bartholomew means the son of Ptolemy, and in first century Judea, a very small pool of names are used for everybody. They kind of go through one of the phases, and so actually names there are loads of people called by the same name, and so you always had to kind of add a little bit extra. So Nathaniel, not just any old Nathaniel, because there's 10 of them around in this crowd, but Nathaniel, who we remind you is also the son of Ptolemy, which is Bartholomew. And actually we know that he comes from Cana, which is kind of interesting because these disciples we're going to see the first miracle in Cana. And so John's gospel kind of presents these guys coming to Jesus. So what we'll do is we'll kind of introduce these, I think, and then that's when we take our break this morning. So just in case you're wondering if you can last for a coffee. So the first one, John the Elder or Presbyter, is actually mentioned by a guy called Papias, who's one of the early church fathers. But since the days of Eusebius, who comes in about the 3rd century BC, various scholars have actually been divided as to whether John the Elder is the same as John the Apostle, because Eusebius is absolutely convinced that they're two different people, you see. So you have a very old tradition that says John the Elder is not the same as John the Apostle. But actually, if you kind of go back even earlier than that, there's a guy called Irenaeus, and Irenaeus was a disciple of a guy called Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John, who wrote the Gospel, and so he's very, very close, and he's absolutely sure that the John the Elder and John the Apostle are the same person. So he refers to the blessed and apostolic presbyter, the blessed and apostolic elder. But the name John the Elder probably comes about. You think about John's letters; it often says the elder too. Is that he as the period of the New Testament is drawing towards its conclusion, Peter has already gone. And as we know, Paul has now been executed, and probably John starts to step into, if you like, an eldership role. It's no longer just about one church. He's become a senior and significant character now for churches in Jerusalem, Antioch, and so on. So he's probably taken on slight difference of title. So the John the Apostle and John the Elder, probably the same person in my view, although mine is the minority view. But but I'm the one you're hearing this morning. I said there are minor advantages and disadvantages to both positions. If John the Elder isn't the same as John the Apostle, he's one of the 72. He appears in a list of the 72, but that's comes a bit later. So he would still be someone who knows Jesus, but John the Elder is probably then the person who's writing the Gospel, which I think is also John the Apostle. That makes sense. At this stage, though, he would be quite young. Because often when we see pictures of Jesus and the disciples, most of them are old and serious. But in actual fact, that's not the picture we get from the Gospels. If we stop and we think about it, actually, I think I've got here, and the reason we can say perhaps that is he's with Andrew. So he's with Andrew, and the two of them encounter Jesus, and then they go and get Simon. Simon is Andrew's older brother, it seems. But Andrew lives with his older brother, so we read that in Mark 1:29. Simon, his older brother, is married and he's got a mother-in-law at that point, but there's no mention of Andrew having any family. Andrew seems to be unmarried, so seems to be an unmarried young man, and he's got a friend who is John. And when it comes to it, there's a point where they have to pay the temple tax. But the only two people in the household who have to pay the temple tax are Peter and Jesus. Do you remember? Jesus went. Now, you pay the temple tax in the town you're growing up in, so we don't have to imagine everybody, because we know, for instance, that Nathaniel comes from Cana. We know that Philip comes from Bethsaida, so they're not there in Capernaum. But we know that Andrew does come from Capernaum. We know that Jesus now lives in Capernaum. We know Simon lives in Capernaum. So there are three people there, but only two of them have to pay the temple tax, which would imply that Andrew is under 20 years old at that point, because you only paid the temple tax once you'd gone through your 20th birthday. And of course, we know he's there towards the end of the period which the New Testament's got written. So Andrew seems to be a young man, and that makes sense of John being a young man. And if John is John the Apostle, it turns out that he is also a cousin of Jesus. We'll look at that in much more detail in a few weeks' time. We're working through the last week of Jesus' life, because it comes out very clearly there. So John the Apostle seems to be a cousin of Jesus, and if he's the beloved cousin, it kind of implies that Jesus has always been a few years ahead of him, perhaps looking after him as they've grown up, in that kind of a way. So we kind of get this sense of both John and Andrew being kind of in their teen years at this stage, which would make a lot of sense. We can't be 100% on it, but I think it's probably the way it is. Let's keep going. Andrew, we're talking through all of the five that appear, and then we'll take a break. So that's John. Then Andrew, he's not often perceived as being one of the inner three, but he's always listed with the inner three. So he's an important apostle, particularly in John's Gospel. And John's Gospel, we see alongside each other Philip and John regularly, but actually Philip, of course, comes in this period. We hear about him in a minute. We'll get on to him. But actually, we also see this dynamic between the two of them. So towards the end of John's Gospel, Philip gets hold of a bunch of God-fearing Greeks, and he takes them first to Andrew, and then the two of them go and take the Greeks to Jesus. So it's in the last week of Jesus' life. Philip finds some God-fearing Greeks, and he goes and gets Andrew, because he seems to have a kind of relationship or a friendship there. And between the two of them, they take the Greeks to meet Jesus. We find them kind of operating together in John's Gospel, but in the feeding of the 5,000. So there's a kind of the famous little moment where Philip kind of says it would cost this much to deal with it, and then Andrew pops up and says, "Yeah, but we've got this lad with a couple of couple of fish and some loaves, if you remember the thing." So you see the two of them there together. What have I put there? He questions. I can't remember what that reference is now off the top of my head, and because we're at speed, you can look it up. He questions Jesus on the thing. Oh, okay, I think it's in the apocalyptic discourse. He asks Jesus about the things that are about to come, things that are about to happen. Just the early church tells us that he does extensive evangelism into Eurasia, which is that kind of where Asia joins on to Europe. So he goes right the way through Scythia. So he gets as far, according to the early church, he takes the gospel as far up as into Russia and up to Kiev, the region where Kiev is now based. And there's no reason not to believe that, because we know the gospel gets there, and tradition tells us that that was Andrew's, if you like, route in terms of mission. Well, sorry, I've just gone right back to slide number 1 because I hit a button on my thing which I think is going to move my presentation forward one, and instead it takes me back to the beginning. So I'll just zoom around, and where have we got to? Yeah, there we go. That was the slide we're on. So Simon Peter, of course, is a well-known character, but he's the third person that is introduced to Jesus at the beginning of John's Gospel in the context of John's ministry. John has been pointing at Jesus, saying he's the one that's to come, and so people start to gather to Jesus. And actually at that point, as Simon Peter kind of approaches Jesus, he's probably a young man. We've covered on this. If his brother's a teenager, but he seems to be a bit older, so perhaps he's about 25 years old. And he becomes the kind of de facto sort of leader of the disciples. We know from not just from tradition, but actually from the history of what he's left behind. He is the planter of the church in Jerusalem, of course. He is the one that is there and preaches when the first Gentiles become believers, and of course he plants the church in Rome. So he's a kind of very, very significant character. I don't need to probably say that. He gets martyred when he's about 60 years old, if he's about 25 at this time, probably around 64 AD where he is martyred. But actually, I think I was about to hit that same button again and go back to the beginning. Oh yeah, okay. I'll just, the way we read about it in John's Gospels, he approaches Jesus and Jesus looks at him and says, "You're Simon. One day you'll be called Peter." But at that point, people don't call him Peter. That actually doesn't happen until towards the end of Jesus' ministry. But just to notice, that first time he predicts it's going to happen. And I won't kind of I won't spend too long now talking about Peter. We'll probably do it when we get to that moment a bit later on. But there's an interesting kind of little mark from this point where Jesus sees him as Simon, but knows that one day he'll be called Peter. Simon means the listener. And Simon is not a good listener. The point when he does become Peter, Jesus says to him that he's heard something from heaven, and now because he heard from heaven, I'm going to talk to you. In other words, you're now finally living up to your name, because you lived up to who you were. Now you can become the new thing. And the new thing is Peter, which is the rock, and he does become that key rock figure. So moving on quickly. So Philip is there. Philip the apostle, just to kind of flag, there's also a Philip the evangelist, who's one of the 7 deacons in the church, and we often confuse the two, and it's that confusion is something that's gone way back. It seems that even in the early church, the two kind of do seem to get a little bit confused. But they do seem to be separate characters as well. But sometimes it's hard to know which one's being talked about when you're reading about. It could be either some places. Other times it has to be one or the other. But so Philip the apostle is also there. He meets Jesus in this first phase. We know that he lives in Bethsaida because we're told that. And where Simon and Andrew had once lived, they're now operating their business in Capernaum, but it refers to it as being their town, which presumably means they were born there, but as they became fishermen, it became more convenient to relocate a few miles to the west to Capernaum, which had much more quick and easy coastal access. As we've got there, church tradition tells us he preaches up into Syria, Greece and Phrygia. Yeah, he appears. Yeah, Philip is a good networker. You find that in John's Gospel. Whenever we meet Philip, he's introducing people. And one of the things Philip is going to do, of course, is introduce the last disciple we're going to look at, which is Nathaniel, in a second. So I think let's go on. I got him on. Yeah, Nathaniel. So Nathaniel has long been identified as being the Bartholomew. He's already touched on that in the Synoptics. And the two are always together, both in the Synoptics and in John. You find Philip is kind of always linked with Nathaniel. So they kind of, there seems to be some sort of friendship in the two. So I've got the quote there from Matthew: Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew. If you remember, I think we looked at this last time, that Matthew's list of the 12 has grouped them into pairs, which you can see there, that Philip and are joined together. Philip and Bartholomew are joined together as a pair. Then kind of we put our modern punctuation in, semicolon, Thomas and Matthew. So it seems that Matthew, because when Jesus sends out his disciple in pairs, has kind of perhaps preserved for us the pairing that went on there, the way that they related. So we see that relationship there kind of emerging with Philip and Bartholomew. And Bartholomew is credited from an evangelism point of view, which is really nice, because actually, again, it's not only is there no reason to disbelieve it, but we do find evidence of the gospel getting early into areas that were referred to as India under Rome, and actually we still think of as India today. And Bartholomew is credited as carrying Matthew's gospel all the way to India. And actually there is a moment in Acts where Bartholomew is paired with Matthew, so you can imagine their relationship. So he carries Matthew's gospel and evangelizes the Indians. And we have a record, which I think we looked at a few months and months ago when we started. One of the early church records is when a particular evangelist some centuries later, called Pantaeus, gets to India. He hears that they've got Matthew's gospel, and also that Thomas has been down there. And so we kind of have, if you like, that later kind of recognition that the apostles actually got into India, the gospel got into India at a very early age. And I've got a final couple of comments on Nathaniel, which I think are a bit interesting. It's probably the wrong time to do it. They take a little bit following the thread here, but there's that famous kind of dialogue. You think, well, what was the background to this? So where Philip says, "Come with me, Nathaniel," and then Nathaniel says, "What, can anything good come out of Galilee?" Which sounds a bit rude, but he himself, of course, comes from Galilee, so he's not kind of like, oh, those Galileans, because he's one himself. And as he approaches, Jesus looks at him and says, "Oh, you're an Israelite without guile." Strange kind of phrase, but straight away Nathaniel kind of relates to it and says, "How do you know me?" and Jesus said, "Well, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Remember the flow? And actually, there is a background in the Old Testament that again, it's one of those things, I've not seen this elsewhere, but if you kind of see it and follow it, because actually the name Israel, it was given to a guy called Jacob. And Jacob, which we often think of, means the heel, but the same word, it is part of the word crafty. So Jacob's name actually means crafty. And so we actually find, I've got here from Jeremiah 9:4 to kind of show you this, to kind of prove it. You can look up Jeremiah 9:4. You'll find that in the Hebrew it's written exactly the same way. So don't trust any brother, because every brother deals, and there is Jacob, craftily. Every brother deals is Jacob, and craftily deals is Akub, and then craftily is Jacob. And it means to deal in a way that trips the heel. That's the way that the word works. Deal in a way that, so it's crafty. And so it becomes part of, if you like, of Jewish folklore that they are crafty. So they like that fact. We like to be crafty. We like to be the crafty ones of Jacob, you see. So here is Nathaniel, who's been meditating on this. He's come down from Galilee, which is a real mess, because it's very kind of mixed up with pagan religions, and the Romans have been there for ages. There's been centuries of folks there. It's hardly feels like a holy place, which is why he says, "Does anything good come out of Galilee?" He's come out of Galilee. He's come down to John's ministry. He's meditating and thinking about what's going on, and he's thinking about what it means to be an Israelite, which means that we came from Jacob and we're a crafty bunch of whatevers. And he's wondering, and here is John saying, "Stop being crafty. Don't be crafty. Be be sensible and clear and straightforward in your dealings. That's part of John's message. So that would clearly be part of it. And as he approaches Jesus, says, "Oh, you're an Israelite without guile." So presumably this has been a thought process that's been going on in Nathaniel. So he says, "How do you know me?" It's not just a random statement. This is something I've been thinking about. I want to lose our kind of craftiness. And Jesus then throws in this reference. As I said, I've got the things there. See an Israelite in whom, how do you know me? Because when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Now, in the middle of the day in the sun, particularly if you're out near the wilderness, you find things with shade. So it doesn't seem that significant to sit in the shade of a fig tree. But actually, a fig tree also has kind of prophetic meaning. And probably if Nathaniel is a kind of reflective sort of person, he's sitting there out of the sun in the shade of the fig tree, thinking about how does Israel lose its craftiness because it comes from Jacob? How do we live up to what John's message is? So he's sitting there in the shade of the tree. It's an everyday activity, but actually in Micah there's that kind of little reference. Come, let's go to the house of God, the Beth Elohi. So it's got that little word Bethel in it. So the house of God is the Beth Elohi here, which includes Bethel, which is actually the place where Jacob first had his craftiness being dealt with, if you remember. He meets God at Bethel. And then it goes on and says, "And each will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and he will not, and no one will make them afraid." That's the way it finishes. I've highlighted that phrase because you'll see why in a second. So there's a kind of as he's sitting under the fig tree, there is an Old Testament reference, and he seems to be a thoughtful, reflective person sitting under my fig tree. Yep, do you know what? And there was that place Bethel, which is kind of part of the reference that if he's reciting in Hebrew, the Bethel of Jacob. The Bethel of Jacob was where God first got hold of him and started to deal with him. He was the crafty deceiver who'd made such a mess of things with his brother Esau that he has to run away. And then this is the first point where God gets hold of him. So perhaps there's a resonance there as he thinks about Bethel, where God starts to deal with Jacob's craftiness. And how are you dealing with Jacob's craftiness now with John the Baptist? And he remembers this verse, and it's under the fig tree, and it's got this little phrase, "and no one will make them afraid." And "no one will make them afraid" actually ties into another verse that has messianic connotations. So it's from a passage about the Messiah. So I put there, note the reference to Bethel and also the phrase "no one will make them afraid," because in one of the other messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, which is there in Zephaniah, the remnant of Israel will do no wrong and tell no lies. Oh yes, in the days of the Messiah, they won't be full of sneakiness. And they shall feed and they will lie down, and no one will make them afraid. You see, so this is in the days when the Messiah comes, and it's the Messiah is referred to, the King of Israel, Yahweh is in your midst. You see, so God is now in their midst, and he's being referred to as the King of Israel. That's the one who's coming. And Nathaniel's presumably meditating on all these connections. He sees them all, and as he sees Jesus, he acknowledges him and says, as being the God King of Zephaniah's vision. So Jesus says to him, you're an Israelite in whom there's no guile. So perhaps he's been thinking about all of these things, playing through the thoughts. How do you know me? How do you know that's a big thing to me? Well, because I saw you sitting under the fig tree. As he sits under the fig tree, he's put these connections together. And actually there's that messianic line that actually that when the Messiah is coming, there won't be any craftiness, and the King of Israel, Yahweh, is in their midst. So he responds at that point. Nathaniel sees the connection, and he acknowledges Jesus as that God King from Zephaniah's vision. He says, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." See, the King of Israel, Yahweh, in the midst. So something about you is about God in our midst. And Jesus kind of finishes the process by going right the way back to Bethel, where Jacob has that first encounter with God, and God comes down the ladder, if you like, at Bethel. If you remember, he falls asleep, and he has a vision where God is coming down, or the angels of God are ascending and descending, and somehow the presence of God is hitting earth. And he wakes up and he stands the stone and says, "This place we'll call Bethel." It's the place of the house of God. And Jesus kind of goes back there with a reference when he then says, hang on, have I got it there? He concludes the dialogue by that reference right at the back, you shall see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So think, where did that quote suddenly come from? But that quote is from the experience of Jacob at Bethel, which is, if you like, the start point of this mental journey that perhaps Nathaniel has been on. So I've spent rather a long time on it, but it's incredible when you kind of see it. You can sort of see the inner life and the process going on in Nathaniel's thinking. And I've put that little note there. Actually, one of the things we're going to see as we kind of tell through the story of Jesus, there's a whole lot of stuff that happens that is far more steeped in kind of, if you like, the language and culture of the Old Testament. And when we see that, we suddenly interpret and understand the events in slightly different ways. So I think that this is the point. Oh, okay, I've got how many more slides? I think I'm just going to quickly see where I've got my break. There it is, just one more. So we'll just address this one. So, because almost straight after this encounter with Nathaniel, 3 days later, Jesus is saying, let's go up to Cana. When Nathaniel comes from Cana, so that makes sense that we've introduced him. You see, at this point, he's going to go with Jesus on this journey. John is a cousin, and if it's a family-related wedding, he would know people there. But however it goes, Jesus goes with several of his disciples, maybe not all of them. We haven't read about the meetings with the others at this point, but he goes with several of his disciples. They travel up to Cana, where we have his first kind of, if you like, public sign, the first thing that is observed by Jesus' disciples. So you've got Jesus, his mother, his family, his disciples. They all visit then Capernaum after that. So they go up to Cana, then they move on to Capernaum. Well, Jesus' cousin, if John is Jesus' cousin, he lives in Capernaum. His mother is Mary's sister, so Mary it's nice for her to go and visit his sister. Andrew and Simon, of course, have both got a fishing business in Capernaum. So you can see there's that kind of logical move after they've been to the wedding in Cana to move on to Capernaum. And at Passover time, Jesus is going to go back down to the south to visit Jerusalem. And there we're going to find, if you like, in many ways, we're going to see the dramatic start to Jesus' ministry. But that is the point where we're going to take a bit of a break. But I suggest at this point, Phil, you can turn your microphone back on and see if there's anyone wants to ask any questions or anything at this stage. Yeah, well, anyone want to ask anything?
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
The temptation, do you, like when, I can't remember exactly when the devil takes Jesus to the top of the temple, do you think that's just like a visionary thing? Or,
yeah, I think...
I mean, presumably purely symbolic.
Yeah, I think that you could, yes, I'm not too worried either way. On the basis that I've talked to a lot of people over the years who often don't make a big thing of it because where a vision has kind of transferred into feeling so real it does feel like they're there, if that and they themselves sometimes wouldn't be totally sure of whether they are there or not, and so given that is and often that experience is they don't talk about it a huge amount because they know that people will think they're nuts. But actually when you say I couldn't really be honest tell you whether it was just part of the vision or whether I was really there or not. So I don't have a problem with the idea that actually there could be a spiritual dimension which actually takes Jesus physically. But I don't think we know, and it probably in that sense it's less important. It's often that way with the intensity of a vision.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So how long do we have as a break, Phil?
Yeah, about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Good time for me to go and get a coffee.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll see you in a bit.
Speak to you in a sec.